Hi, everyone. I am going to talk a little bit about the readings that you had for class this week in culturally responsive leadership. And with this, so let me get this slide up. There we go. This culturally responsive leadership, this theme comes from the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching, which a lot of times you'll see people will use this as a conceptual type of framework. So, looking at these different tenets that make up culturally responsive teaching. Um, is a point of analysis you'll see in a lot of different studies. So actually, in the Ann Lopez's study that's on for this weekend, looking at navigating cultural borders, she is talking about these spaces through the lens of culturally responsive leadership. So I kind of look at this as an extension of multicultural education. So, as you read for last week, there are these different theories that inform multicultural ed either through critical pedagogy, critical race theory, or anti-racist teaching. But sometimes people also talk about how culturally relevant pedagogy is an extension of this. So it's important to note two people who often get talked about the most when we're talking about culturally relevant pedagogy. The first one here is Gloria Ladson-Billings, and she talks about how culturally relevant pedagogy it empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically, using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So she is most known for this piece of work right here, The Dream Keepers, that came out in 1994. And in this work, she did a study with 8 teachers at a school that served predominantly African American children, and these were teachers who were high performing and were considered to be highly effective teachers. And so through processes of nominations, she did this research in their classrooms. And so she spent a lot of time with these teachers, and she using the field work of being in the classrooms and studying and learning from them, she came up with this framework that we have now used, and it's very dominant in the field, um, with these 3 different tenets. And so it's usually around the idea of here academic achievement, how we can think more extensively about what it means to achieve. So engagement's a really important part of student learning, and just other ways to assess that are more than just about just test scores. That's only one part of it. The other part focuses on this idea of cultural competence, which it sounds like that's probably what folks in this class are most familiar with. I can kind of consider that just a more more simplistic version of culturally relevant pedagogy. But this is the idea where you align teaching with students' cultural backgrounds, beliefs, and practices. But it doesn't just mean that it's with students' own backgrounds, but also exposing students to a diversity of differences. That would be a part of cultural competence. So finding ways to equip students with this knowledge. And then the third area that comes up a lot is this socio-political consciousness. And so really helping students to see like their role in society. And this begins with teachers. So you might have um, teachers being aware of issues of race, class, gender in themselves, and how that's incorporated in the classroom. So these are the 3 tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy that we see in the literature used a lot when people are using this as a framework. Now, the other person who often is associated with this type of work is Geneva Gay, and she is associated with this term culturally responsive teaching. So it's a little bit less of a like 3 tenet system in that it's used in this way, but it's a similar idea, like using students' vantage points, their frames of reference, to think about how you're teaching in classrooms. And so there's a list here that you can read more in detail from her text here that talks about all of the different ways we think about teaching. Geneva Gay probably focuses more on the teacher themselves and like the curriculum that they're talking about, whereas Gloria Ladson-Billings talks a lot more about pedagogy. So there's some slight differences in their work, but they're often put in conversation with one another. So that's just to give you a little foundational background knowledge on these 2 women who are very influential in this field of culturally responsive education. Now, the first piece that I had asked you to use was pulling from these women's work in here, Sonia, Hortsford, Grossland, and Gunn here. So little information about them that you could look at and see their research interests. But in this piece in particular, they're building from the work of culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching to create this framework for culturally relevant leadership. And as you can see in the piece here, they pull together these 4 contexts that they think is necessary to be a part of thinking about leadership. So the political context here is entrenched in everything. So understanding this demographic divide that was talked about. I often hear in my field of teacher education, we talk about teachers and the racial and ethnic divide between teachers who are teaching the students they're serving. As we see in this article, and it makes sense, of course, that administration and principals and superintendents and other educational leaders, this mirrors this because most people come from teaching as a background. So understanding the demographic divide and what that might mean with background knowledge, values, ideologies, perspectives. So that's a really important part that all of this is couched in. But then the different ways that the professional duties, the personal journeys, and the pedagogical approach are all interconnected with each other and flowing back and forth. So this framework is a way that they're talking about how the work of culturally relevant teaching can be applied to thinking about leadership. So if this is something that's of interest to you, looking to see other people who have been using culturally relevant leadership might be a path you go down in the future. And seeing also like who's citing this article. So using Google Scholars is a great way to see if you put in the article and then check to see who cited it, see what kind of studies are being done using this framework. This might be a good way to begin thinking about how you might be conceptualizing a framework in your own research in the future. And then this other piece by Laurie Johnson was also interesting in that it took on this idea of culturally responsive leadership. If you pay attention, they were citing a lot of the same people. She didn't per se create a framework in this piece, but she instead used it, again, as her lens to think about how to extend it. So she extended the framework. By using these 3 oral histories. And so you can click more on her and learn more about her and her research interest here. But this is a good example of how sometimes people extend the framework. So in your dissertation research, a lot of times, like you would say, I'm going to use the concept of culturally relevant leadership, and you might couple it with something else. It might not just be that. But you might not necessarily extend it, but if there's something you're doing with the community, you might rely on like Laurie Johnson's piece to help you with thinking about how to frame the research that you're interested in doing. So, we'll keep coming back to that and talking more. These are some of the questions that I was going to ask you to talk about today in class, because I wanted to think about how we often talk about culturally relevant teaching so much with teachers. So, like, what roles you think as leaders in your schools, in your whatever settings you're in, your educational settings, how what this looks like. So some of the personal characteristics involved, the instructional behaviors, attitudes, dispositions, and in general, like how does this interact? So I want you to think about that. And we don't have to have this conversation today because I think you're actually going to be talking about this when you're looking at your case study again, looking at it through this culturally relevant lens. So that's something that can come up in that. I'm going to move this last question because I think it's interesting to think about these oral histories and how these are examples of culturally relevant pedagogy. So give you some time to kind of think about how this type of research exhibits what Johnson's talking about with culturally responsive leadership. And also if there's anything from the Hortsford article that helps with analyzing these leaders, Gertrude Lloyd and Len, in thinking about who they are. So I'm going to leave that as a space to talk about and to dialogue with you as we move forward. And I'm gonna come back to this last question when we meet in person again, because this is something that I've heard a lot too, is that sometimes people think culturally relevant pedagogy is really something only for when you're in really diverse school spaces, and by diverse we usually mean racially and ethnically. But so a lot of people have argued that there's reasons why educators should embrace this type of pedagogy. So I do want to come back to this question. It makes me think back to when I was asking you about the similarities and differences between urban and rural schools. But again, I want you to think about this, like how if you're in an all-black school versus being in like in an all-white school and like the different settings, how might you think about the necessity of using culturally relevant pedagogy? technology. So food for thought, and to continue to ponder right now. I wanted to just pull up the schedule too before I end this. And so, like, this is what we were going to be talking about tonight that I think we can just continue to build on. You have your online class technically starting tomorrow. It's already up, so you're welcome to work on that now and during the time that we might have lost in class tonight. Reading chapter 6 from the text, and then also Lopez's article, which is a great example of culturally relevant leadership. So that's going to be your first discussion board that's going to be due on Sunday. And remember, I'll keep it open. I have it due on Sunday for right now just to make sure the reminder comes in, but then I'll reopen it again. So if you need time to respond to your small groups, you have that. And then from there, I'll post a second question on Monday morning based on where we are. Your case study notes are using your same case study that you had, and I was actually going to spend some time talking with you in small groups tonight about it, but instead what I'll do is I will write some feedback on your actual Google document and ask you some questions and whatnot. So you also, if you happen to want to meet, you can also use this time tonight to talk about the case study again through the culturally relevant leadership lens. That's a possibility too. So in terms of schedule changes, though, so I'm not going to see you for 2 weeks. So I won't see you again until October 12th, which feels like for forever. But actually, in a strange way, it kind of works out because I actually was going to have Dr. Sherry Fairchild Kai's. I wanted her to come talk about culturally responsive leadership. She's a principal in the work she does in her schools, but she couldn't do it on tonight's date. So she's actually going to Skype into us on October 12th. So we'll begin class kind of pulling together all of these different things that we talked about. And then we'll move into looking at different leadership theories for different sociocultural needs. In particular, we'll talk about what's called queer theory, and we'll look at issues of religion. Not that religion is per se a theory, but the way it's written in chapters 8 and 9 talks a lot about the different needs that come up when we're talking about LGBTQ students, and also a lot of different needs that come up when we're talking about different religious beliefs. And so we'll complicate that and thinking about the role of leadership in these situations. And if this is a topic that you express interest in, these might be some leadership styles that you're interested in learning more about. And then we'll continue and move back to our different topics here. I'll have more information for you about what I want you to turn in for the final case study report in our next in-person class too. So just keep doing what you're doing for now and that'll work out. The other change that I made that I was going to talk about tonight in person was actually I needed to make our joint class an online class, and I talked to Dr. Soltz about it, and he said he had plenty of reading for you all to do that night, and it was fine. I had something. Actually going to be in the middle of moving, so it was going to be a really challenging thing for me to be able to get to Columbus. So what I didn't want to add another online class though, because I had already worked out the syllabus and the points, and I had already told you they'd only be so many. So what I said here is that I'm assigning the same readings, and I did change them I found some readings that I thought fit a lot better. But we're going to combine the readings from this class, and we'll talk about it all on the November 16th date. There was going to be a second reading here, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, we'll have all 4 readings for that night. So it's a lot of readings for that night, but just keep in mind it's going to be about covering 2 classes. And then we'll move from there. And before we know it, geez, the semester will be over. It's kind of crazy how quick time has gone. So your discussion question though is up under the discussion board here. The first question, and I'm going to add to it, but it should be, there we go. It should be up. Your 2A is the first part. You're again in small groups, just sorted so that you only will talk to a few students in your group. And then on Monday morning, I will add 2B. So yeah, if you have any questions, please just send me an email. If anyone needs to check in, I am available for a Google Hangout. And I hope all is well. I hope that you can use this time to catch up and feel that you are on track. And so, yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for your flexibility, and I apologize for any inconvenience. And I appreciate that we have technology to keep us going. Have a great rest of your weekend.